What is all the hype around the Spring framework? Do you already know that you want to learn Spring but aren't sure where to start? Hello, I'm Brian Hansen and welcome to my course on Spring Fundamentals on Pluralsight. In this course, we're going to be learning about developing with Spring, and we'll use the various configuration methods to illustrate some of the common problems we often face in development. We will develop part of an application without Spring, and then show how to configure that part of the application using Java configuration, XML configuration, and annotations. We will also discuss the lifecycle of Spring and how to use beans in a more appropriate fashion. What is Spring? Well, the Spring framework started out as just an inversion of control container. This technique is often referred to as dependency injection. It was conceived to reduce or replace some of the complex configuration of the earlier Java Enterprise Edition. Spring was later built around using Java without EJBs, so its original concept was how to work better with EJBs, and then they realized that they just didn't need those for a lot of situations. So it kind of transitioned into, okay, how can I do the same development without using Enterprise Java beans? This course is designed to show you how to use Spring, and since Spring is a dependency injection container, we will also discuss why. Dependency injection is very simply removing hard-coded wiring in your app and using a framework to inject dependency resources where they are needed. So again, what is Spring? Well, it is a framework built around reducing the complexities around enterprise Java development, and later also providing enterprise development without EJBs. Spring can essentially be used with or without enterprise Java beans, and primarily now is used without them. This is an important point because Spring enabled us to do enterprise development without using an application server. A lot of people don't realize that Tomcat really isn't an application server, and it's just a web server. This is one of the reasons that Tomcat has taken over for Java development as a standard container. It's very easy to use, it's lightweight, and until Spring, you either weren't using enterprise features or you had to use a more complex, harder to use application server. I should also mention that it is completely Pojo based. Any code you write in Spring can be written without using Spring at all. Pojo, as you may or may not remember, stands for a plain old Java object. The Spring framework really isn't doing any magical thing behind the scene, it's just helping us write better, cleaner code and doing things Pojo based and interface driven. So we've already talked about it being lightweight, but we should also point out that Spring was built out of the frustrations of J2E, so it's very unobtrusive. It shouldn't be getting in your way. If it is, you're using it wrong. Spring also uses AOP and proxies to apply things like transactions to your code to get those cross-cutting concerns out of your application, so your code should actually be smaller and more lightweight from using Spring. One of the most appealing parts of Spring to me is that it's built around best practices. We end up having design patterns in our code without us even realizing that we're using them. Things like singletons, factories, abstract factories, all those best practices are built into our code. Some people may argue that I should know those to get into it. That's true. Having that knowledge of patterns will only help increase your understanding of what Spring is doing, but it can help make new developers or less experienced developers come up to speed and use these patterns more effectively without having that knowledge firsthand. There's patterns like a singleton in there, a factory, an abstract factory, the template method. Spring actually uses template method a lot, and although it's really not a pattern, it's a design methodology or a best practice, there's annotation-based configuration. If all of this doesn't make much sense to you, don't be concerned because you can still learn Spring without understanding many of those details. What problem is Spring trying to solve? Whenever I'm going to introduce another framework or tool into my codebase, I want to look and see what it's actually buying me. These are the big questions I ask. What is this trying to solve for me? Well, Spring brings to the table quite a few things. It increases our testability. It increases our maintainability, or the ability to maintain our code. It also helps us with scalability. I call these the ABLs, the testable, maintainable, scalable type properties of our code. It decouples things and makes it so that we can add caching layers, things like that in there. There's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover in this class, but these are all a focus that Spring and the principles behind Spring help us deliver on. It also helps us reduce code complexity. And lastly, though, and this is my biggest point that it tries to solve for us, is that it puts the focus on our business. The business doesn't care what framework I'm using. They care about what we're getting coded done. And Spring helps us get complex code done faster, makes it more maintainable, testable, and helps remove that complexity. It just makes everything a little bit easier for us as a developer. As I mentioned in the previous slides, that Spring helps us focus on the business need. If you've ever done much database development in Java, you've used JDBC. JDBC at first glance doesn't look that bad, but then you really start picking it apart and it's really not very pretty. Look at all this extra stuff we have in our code just to do a simple select statement. We have connections and prepared statements and result sets, and then we have this try-catch block. We have a driver manager. We have all this stuff in there. And look at that great big finally block, or the if or else equals null, if statement equals null, and if connection equals null. And we have this empty curly brace catching exceptions. There's a big bunch of just code in here when really all our business cares about is this line here where we say select whatever our fields are from the car table, where this ID equals whatever, and then the only other line that our business really cares about is where we grab that actual string and store it in an object and return it. Now this may look like a great selling point for Hibernate instead of Spring, but actually I'm going to show you a few things that Spring does to make this easier. So all these places where we're assigning things and handling and closing and all that type of stuff can easily be contained by Spring for us. We should handle this by using Spring to inject these resources into our code. The solution we're looking to get from Spring, or from using the Spring framework, is that we can remove configuration code or lookup code, and developers can focus on the business needs. Like I said, that's a big one for me, and it's the business that doesn't care that I have a try-catch block or how I handle this exception. They care that when we ask for a car, we get that car back. Our code can also focus on testing. So on that previous slide, it really wasn't that testable as far as things were hard-coded in there. I have a driver manager that I'm getting a connection, where's that connection coming from, that type of stuff. Spring also helps us with doing annotation or XML-based development, as well as the Java configuration that we're going to mainly focus on. If we want to annotate our code rather than having so much configuration code in there, Spring can help us with all of that as well. To achieve all of this, Spring encourages development through interfaces. We will dive into this concept deeper in the implementation of our code, but interface-driven development really changes the approach we take with our code. So it makes things easier to test, makes things more focused on what the business needs, and removes that configuration lookup code through doing annotations or Java-based configuration or even the XML-based approach as well. Let's look at that business focus slide again, the JDBC code that we had looked at earlier, and show what it could look like by using the Spring framework. This was our code before with all of the get connection, driver manager, prepared statement stuff, that huge finally block that essentially does nothing but close connections for us. And then let's see what that code could look like while utilizing Spring. Now, I will say that this one particular library in Spring, not necessarily Spring Core, that this is the Spring JDBC template code, but it's the same concept that we're trying to drive in Spring. Notice that nowhere in here is it mentioned a connection result set, a prepared statement, a driver manager. Doesn't talk about closing any of that stuff off. In fact, there's not even a try catch finally statement in here at all. We have our find by and our return statement. And this is using the entity manager stuff in there, but this example of a template method pattern is just being done for us. This is one of those cases where Spring is using a template method pattern and we don't really have to know how or what it's doing behind the scenes. Now, this may scare some of you that there's this huge black box with Spring, and I hope to alleviate those concerns for you throughout this course, but look at how much smaller and more condensed this code is, and it's really just doing what we want it to do. There's no reason we should have to write what's on the left for every query we need to make inside of our application. How does this all work? Great, we've seen that it can reduce business focus for us, but how does it do this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, everything in Spring is a simple POJO, a plain old Java object. Spring itself can be thought of as a glorified hash map. It's actually called the application context. The application context is the configured Spring container with all of the dependencies wired up in it. Now, I don't want to simplify it too much. It's doing more than just creating a hash map and shoving objects in there, but I also don't want people to be afraid of it because there's too much going on behind the scenes. There's too much magic happening with Spring, because there's really not. Spring can also be used as a registry, and that's how I'm going to show you to start with, because we're just going to use a little main method in an application to run it. But to really get all the benefit of Spring, we'll go through its wiring constructs and use it to auto-wire our application. Since this is an update for this course, we're trying to standardize the application that we use to build across multiple courses. And we've opted to do a conference registration app, and we're going to specifically focus on the model and wiring of this application. We're going to be looking at a conference application, and the configuration that we do throughout that will focus primarily on the model of that wiring, so the session objects for the conference session and the speakers for those sessions, and we may add attendees in there as well to demonstrate all of the characteristics that we want to for wiring up this application. Now that we've spoken a little bit about what Spring is, the problems that we're trying to solve with Spring, and what the solution is, we can now appreciate what that problem is and how Spring can be a solution for it. The business focus is what you're going to see me drive towards in all of our examples that we do, and how this enables us to get what the business wants done faster. Let's get our project set up and dive into the architecture of our app now.